My name is Renee Foster. I am 39 years old, and I teach fourth grade at an elementary school in Sacramento, California. 3 months ago, my younger brother accidentally added me to a group chat I was never supposed to see. It was called Mom Stuff Too, and scrolling up through months of messages in it, I found out that my 3 siblings had been planning my mother's entire future, where she'd live, what would happen to her house, even how the money from selling it would eventually get divided among us without me. Not without telling me yet. Without me, period, as a participant in the conversation at all. The reason I got added to that chat by mistake is almost funny, in a way that took me a long time to actually laugh about. But what I found once I was in there wasn't funny at all, and it's the reason my relationship with my siblings looks different today than it did 3 months ago. Before I get into it, if this is your first time here, I tell stories like this one most days, true stories about families and the quiet arrangements inside them that nobody really examines until something forces them to. If that sounds like your kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read all of them. Okay, let me back up and tell you how we got here. I'm the second of 4 kids. My older sister Lisa is 44, my older brother Mark is 42, I'm 39, and my younger brother Derek is 35. We grew up in Sacramento, in a modest 3-bedroom house in the Tahoe Park neighborhood that our parents bought in 1981, the same house our mom, Diane, still lives in now at 71. Our dad passed away 8 years ago, a heart attack, sudden, no long illness, no warning, and since then, Mom has lived alone in that house, which she's always said she has no intention of ever leaving. They'll have to carry me out of here, she used to joke, in a tone that made it clear she didn't think that was likely to happen for a very long time. Growing up, our house wasn't big, but it was always full Sunday dinners that started as just our family of 6, and somehow always ended up with at least 2 or 3 extra people. Usually a neighbor kid, or one of Mom's co-workers from the school district office, where she worked for almost 30 years. My dad worked for the city, in the parks department, and I remember him coming home smelling like cut grass almost every day from April through October. He wasn't a big talker, but he was the kind of dad who showed up. Every soccer game, every school play, even the ones where I had a non-speaking role as Tree 3 in the 3rd grade holiday pageant, which he still brought up, fondly, 25 years later. When he died, 8 years ago, it was sudden enough that none of us really had time to prepare, and I think that shaped how our family operates in ways that took me a long time to notice. There was no long illness, no advance planning, no conversations about what Dad would have wanted, because nobody had ever needed to have those conversations. Things just had to get figured out, fast, in the weeks after, the funeral, the life insurance, what to do with his truck, all of it. And what I remember most about that time is that we did figure it out together, the 4 of us plus Mom, sitting around that same kitchen table at Mom's house, going through everything piece by piece. It wasn't always easy, but it was always all of us. I think, looking back, that's part of why what happened with Mom Stuff Too felt so disorienting. It wasn't just that I'd been excluded from a conversation. It was that it broke a pattern I didn't even know I was relying on. A pattern that had held up through the hardest thing our family had ever been through. About 5 months ago, that joke stopped being a joke. Mom had a fall in the bathroom. She was getting out of the shower, slipped, and ended up on the floor for almost 2 hours before she managed to reach her phone and call Lisa, who lives closest, about 15 minutes away. She broke her wrist and bruised her hip badly enough that she couldn't really walk without help for almost 3 weeks. Nothing life-threatening, thankfully, but it was the kind of incident that, in every family I've ever talked to about this stuff, ends up being a turning point. The moment when Mom's getting older, stops being an abstract idea and becomes a concrete, ongoing logistical question that somebody has to actually deal with. In the weeks right after the fall, there was a flurry of activity that felt, at the time, completely normal. There's a family group chat just called Family, the same one we've had for probably 8 years, with all 5 of us in it, Mom included, even though Mom mostly uses it to send blurry photos of her garden. In the days after the fall, that chat was busy. Who was driving Mom to her follow-up appointments? Who was bringing groceries? Whether she needed a shower chair, that kind of thing. I live about 40 minutes away in Elk Grove, and I have 2 kids and a full-time teaching job, so I wasn't able to be there as often as Lisa, who lives closest and ended up doing the bulk of the day-to-day stuff in those first few weeks. I want to say clearly, before I go any further, that I was and am genuinely grateful to Lisa for that. She stepped up in a way that mattered, and I told her so more than once during that time. What I didn't fully register, in the middle of all that, because honestly, who's paying close attention to the metadata of a family group chat during a crisis, is that somewhere around 2.5 weeks after Mom's fall, the messages in Family about logistics started to thin out. Not disappear exactly, there were still messages about Mom's appointments, still the occasional garden photo from Mom herself. But the planning-type conversations, the "so what's the actual long-term plan here" conversations, seemed to just stop happening in that chat. I remember noticing this, vaguely, and thinking that things must have settled down, that Mom was recovering well enough that the more serious planning conversations weren't urgent anymore. That was true, in a sense. The planning conversations hadn't stopped, they just moved somewhere else. I want to take a minute here to describe what my relationship with my siblings was like before any of this, because I think it matters for understanding both how this happened and how it felt to discover it. Lisa, Mark, Derek, and I have always been close, not in a constant contact way, but in a way where, if something actually mattered, we'd all show up. When Mark went through his divorce 6 years ago, all 3 of us took turns having him over for dinner so he wouldn't be alone every night. When my younger son was born with a minor heart defect that needed monitoring for his first year, Lisa drove down from Sacramento to Elk Grove more times than I can count, just to sit with me at appointments so I wouldn't be alone in the waiting room. We have, by most standards, a genuinely good relationship as adult siblings, and I want to be honest that this is part of why what happened felt so disorienting. It wasn't that I discovered my siblings secretly didn't like me or had some long-standing grudge. It was something stranger and, in a way, harder to make sense of. A kind of logistical drift, where at some point, without any single dramatic decision, I'd stopped being someone they thought to include. Lisa had, by that point, become the de facto point person for Mom's care, which made sense. She lived closest. She's the oldest, and she's always been the one who, at family gatherings, ends up organizing things, whether it's Thanksgiving dinner or a group gift for someone's birthday. Mark lives in Roseville, about 30 minutes from Mom, and Derek, my younger brother, lives in Folsom with his wife, also about 30 minutes away. So geographically, the 3 of them are all within a tight cluster around Mom's house, and I'm the outlier, 40 minutes in the opposite direction. I think that geography ended up mattering more than any of us realized at the time. There's something else worth mentioning about that period, which is that it overlapped almost exactly with the end of the school year ramping up, IEP meetings, state testing, the kind of stretch where I'm often at school until 6 or 7 in the evening, and then grading at home afterward. When Lisa would post updates in the family chat during the day, I'd often see them hours later and respond with something brief, a heart reaction, or "Thank you so much for being there. Let me know if I can do anything." I want to be honest that, looking back, some of my own responses during that period probably read, from the outside, like someone who was a little checked out, not because I didn't care, but because I was responding in the 30 seconds I had between a parent email and a staff meeting. I don't think that excuses anything that happened later, but I think it's part of the full picture. And I'd rather include it than pretend I was a perfectly attentive sibling the entire time and everyone else simply failed me. I should say a little about what my life actually looks like, day to day, because I think it's relevant to how this whole thing unfolded. I've been teaching 4th grade for 14 years at the same school. My days start at 6:15 when I get my own 2 kids up and fed, and by 7:30 I'm at school, where I stay until at least 4, often later during testing season, and then I come home to my own kids' homework, dinner, baths, the whole routine. My phone during the school day is in a drawer in my classroom district policy, but also just practically necessary, because 26 9-year-olds do not leave room for checking your phone. By the time I actually look at it most days, I have, on a normal day, somewhere between 15 and 40 notifications, most of which are completely unimportant school district mass emails, a parent Facebook group, sale notifications from stores I've apparently never unsubscribed from. I mention this only because it's part of why Mom Stuff 2 sat there unread for 3 months. It wasn't that I was avoiding it. It's that on any given day, it looked, at a glance, like one more thing in a pile of things that could wait. The accident, and I do believe it was an accident in the most literal sense, happened on a Tuesday evening in March. I was grading spelling tests at my kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a notification. Derek added you to Mom Stuff 2. My first thought, genuinely, was that this must be some kind of typo or duplicate. Maybe Derek had meant to add me to the existing family chat for some reason, or maybe Mom Stuff 2 was some new logistics thread the 4 of us were starting, like a more focused version of the planning conversations that had quieted down in the main chat. I opened it, expecting maybe 2 or 3 messages. Instead, I found a group chat with Lisa, Mark, Derek, and Derek's wife, whose name is also Renee, which is, I promise, the entire reason any of this happened, going back almost 3 months. 3 months of messages. And as I started scrolling up, I realized within about 30 seconds that this was not a chat I had been meant to see. If you've ever opened something and immediately known, in your gut, before you'd even read the details, that you'd stumbled onto something you weren't supposed to find, type wait in the comments. I want to know how common this feeling actually is, because it's a very specific kind of dread, and it hit me before I'd even read a single full message. Here's the thing about the name mix-up, because I think it's worth explaining clearly, since it's such a small, almost absurd detail that ended up changing everything. Derek's wife is named Renee Foster, same as me, since she took our last name when they got married 7 years ago. In Derek's phone, he has 2 contacts named Renee Foster, his wife and me, his sister. When he created the Mom Stuff 2 group chat back in December, 3 months before any of this, he'd meant to add his wife, so she could be looped in on planning conversations about Mom, since she's been close to Mom for years and often drives her to appointments when Derek's at work. He opened his contacts, typed Renee, and this is the part that's almost funny, in hindsight, picked the wrong one. He added me instead of his wife, and then apparently never noticed because the chat was mostly quiet at first, and I never said anything because I never saw it until 3 months later when he went to add someone else to the chat, scrolled through the existing members, presumably thought, wait, why does this say Renee Foster twice? And tried to fix it by adding the other Renee Foster, his actual wife, which is the notification that landed on my phone that Tuesday night. So for 3 months, I had technically been a silent, invisible member of a group chat I never opened, never got notifications from in any way I noticed. I have a lot of muted group chats between school stuff and parent groups, and this one had apparently been muted by default, or I'd swiped it away without registering what it was. And nobody in the chat had any idea I was in there, reading nothing. Until Derek's attempt to fix his mistake triggered a notification that made me open it for the first time. What I found, scrolling up through 3 months of messages, broke down into roughly 3 categories, and I want to walk through each of them because each one landed differently. The first category was logistics, and on its own, this part wouldn't have bothered me much. There were messages about scheduling Mom's physical therapy appointments, coordinating who was bringing her dinner on which nights, a whole conversation about which grocery delivery service worked best for her neighborhood. Reasonable stuff. If this had been the whole chat, I think I would have felt a little hurt at being left out of the day-to-day coordination, but I also would have understood it. I'm 40 minutes away, I have a full-time job and 2 kids, and there's a practical logic to the 3 siblings who live closest handling the closest in logistics among themselves. The second category was the part that started to feel different. A long, multi-week conversation about whether Mom should move into an assisted living facility. This wasn't just, should we think about this someday? This was active research. Lisa had toured 2 facilities, one in Carmichael and one in Citrus Heights, and had typed up detailed notes comparing them. Cost per month, what was included, the ratio of staff to residents, whether they had a waiting list. There were photos Lisa had taken during the tour. There was a tentative date, about 6 weeks out from when I was reading this, for Mom to do a trial weekend stay at the Citrus Heights facility, framed in the messages as something they'd present to Mom as a nice little getaway, rather than what it actually was, which was an audition for permanent placement. The third category was the one that actually made my hands shake while I was reading it on my kitchen table. It was a conversation. Really, it was several conversations, spread across multiple weeks, about the house and about money. Here's what I learned. The 3 of them, Lisa, Mark, and Derek, with occasional input from Derek's wife, the other Renee, had been operating under the assumption, for at least 2 months, that if and when Mom moved into assisted living, the house would be sold relatively quickly afterward, both to help cover the cost of her care, and because, as one message from Mark put it, none of us are going to want to deal with an empty house 40 minutes from where we live. There was a thread where Lisa had gotten an informal estimate from a real estate agent, a friend of hers, about what the house might sell for in its current condition versus after some basic updates, which she described as just so we have real numbers, nothing official yet. The estimate was somewhere in the range of $480,000 to $520,000, depending on the updates. And then there was the conversation about how that money would be divided. This is the part I keep coming back to. The house, like everything else in my parents' modest estate, had always been something the 4 of us assumed, without ever explicitly discussing it, because who discusses these things while their mother is still alive and well? Would eventually be split evenly, 4 ways, the way our dad's small life insurance payout had been split evenly 4 ways 8 years ago, without any conversation at all, because it was just obviously what you do. In Mom's stuff, too, there was a message from Lisa, and I want to be precise about how I read this, because I've gone back and forth on it. That said, just thinking out loud here, but with Renee and my husband, both working and doing fine, and the rest of us all having either bigger expenses right now, or, Derek and Renee with the new baby coming, would it be totally unreasonable to think about the split being more like the 3 of us splitting it and Renee getting a smaller piece, or even just being bought out of her share now for a flat amount instead of waiting for the eventual sale. Not trying to be unfair, just thinking about who actually needs it most right now. Mark had responded with a thumbs-up emoji. Derek had responded, "Yeah, I mean, she'd probably be fine with whatever, honestly. She's pretty easygoing about this stuff." I sat with that message for a long time before I read any further. She'd probably be fine with whatever. She's pretty easygoing about this stuff. I think what got me about that sentence specifically wasn't even the substance of it, it was the casualness. The sense that my reaction to a conversation about my own inheritance, about my own mother's house, about a financial decision that would affect my family for years, had already been predecided by people who weren't me, based on a general impression of my personality, without anyone actually asking me. I kept scrolling and found one more thing from about 3 weeks before I discovered the chat that I think is worth including, even though it's the hardest one to talk about. There had been a conversation about who would tell Mom about the assisted living trial weekend and how to frame it to her. And at some point, Lisa wrote, "Also, I think we should probably keep this group separate from the main family chat for now, at least until we have an actual plan to present." Renee tends to get pretty emotional about mom stuff, and I don't want a half-formed plan turning into a whole big conversation before we even know what we're proposing. I read that sentence probably 6 times. Renee tends to get pretty emotional about mom stuff. I want to be honest, I don't think this was meant cruelly. I think if you'd asked Lisa in that moment, she would have said she was being practical, that I do, in fact, tend to be the sibling who cries at family gatherings, who gets choked up talking about Dad even 8 years later, who texted the family chat, "I just miss him so much today," out of nowhere on a random Tuesday last fall. All of that is true about me. But reading that sentence, in that context, I understood for the first time that somewhere along the way, Renee gets emotional, had stopped being just an observation about my personality, and had become a reason to root important decisions about my own family around me. Before I called Aaron in, I went back through the chat one more time, more slowly, because I think part of me didn't fully believe what I'd read the first time and needed to check it again. The second read-through was, if anything, worse, not because I found anything new, but because the ordinariness of it all hit me differently. These weren't dramatic messages. There were no exclamation points, no arguments, nothing that read, on its own, as a moment. It was just 3 months of completely normal-sounding logistics conversation. What time works for the tour? Can someone grab the binder with Mom's insurance stuff? Lal Renee just sent me 15 photos of the assisted living lobby, with, woven through it, this other layer that none of them seemed to register as unusual at all. That was the part that actually scared me a little, that to the 3 of them, this was just what planning looked like. Normal. Efficient, even. And I had been, without knowing it, the one variable they'd quietly planned around. I didn't respond in the chat. I sat at my kitchen table for what felt like a long time. My husband, Aaron, came in at some point and asked if I was okay, and I think I said something like, "Give me a minute," in a voice that must have sounded strange, because he sat down across from me and waited. I told him everything, the assisted living research, the trial weekend, the house estimate, the conversation about my share of the inheritance, the she'd probably be fine with whatever message. The Renee tends to get pretty emotional message. Aaron listened to all of it without saying much, and then he asked me a question that ended up being really important for how I handled the next few days. Do you want to respond to what's in the chat, or do you want to talk to them about the fact that the chat exists at all? Because I think those might lead to pretty different conversations. I didn't have an answer right away. Part of me wanted to type out a furious message right there in mom stuff too, addressing every single thing I'd read, point by point. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that responding inside that chat, a chat I'd been an accidental, invisible member of for 3 months, felt like it would make the whole conversation about the chat itself, about the mistake, about catching them. And what I actually cared about wasn't catching anyone. It was the fact that decisions about my mother's life, and about my own financial future, had been happening in a room I wasn't in, for reasons that had apparently included an assessment of my personality that nobody had ever shared with me directly. If you've made it this far, only about 3% of people who watch videos like this one ever actually subscribe. If you're invested in how this conversation went, that small click helps this channel keep finding stories like Renee's. Okay, back to it. I decided not to respond in Mom Stuff 2 at all. Instead, the next morning, I called Lisa directly. Not a text, a phone call, which between Lisa and me is reserved for things that actually matter, and I think she knew immediately, from the fact that I was calling instead of texting, that something was going on. Hey, so this is going to be a strange conversation, I said. Derek accidentally added me to a group chat last night. It's called Mom Stuff 2. I read through it, all of it going back to December. There was a long pause. Genuinely long enough that I almost said something else just to fill the silence, but I made myself wait. "Oh my God," Lisa finally said. "Renee, okay, I think we need to talk about this in person, not on the phone. Can I come over tonight after the kids are in bed?" Lisa came over that evening, and I want to describe how that conversation went honestly, because it wasn't the screaming match that maybe it sounds like it should have been, and I think the way it actually went is more useful than a more dramatic version would be. The first thing Lisa said, sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd read the messages the night before, was, "I owe you an apology, and I think probably Mark and Derek do too, but I want to start with mine because I think the keep it separate from the main chat idea was mine, and I think a lot of the framing around how we talked about you in there, I think that came from me too, more than the others." I asked her, honestly, why a separate chat? Why not just include me in the conversations from the start, the way the four of us had always done everything? Lisa's answer took a while to get out, and I'm going to try to represent it fairly, because I think it's more complicated than "I wanted to cut you out of money." She said that in the weeks right after Mom's fall, when she was the one driving to Mom's house multiple times a week, sitting with her at appointments, handling the immediate crisis. She'd started to feel like she was the only one who really understood how serious things were. Not because Mark and Derek and I didn't care, but because she was the one seeing it up close, every day, in a way the rest of us, from 40 minutes or 30 minutes away, weren't. And I think, she said, somewhere in there, I started thinking of myself as the person who got to define what the real situation was, and everyone else as people who needed to be managed, kind of. Including you. Especially you, maybe, because you're the one who I knew would have the strongest emotional reaction, and I didn't want to deal with that on top of everything else I was dealing with. So I told myself I was being practical. Get the research done, get a plan together, and then present it to everyone, to you, as something close to finished, so there wouldn't be a long, messy back and forth. I told myself that was for everyone's benefit. But reading it back through your eyes, I can see that what it actually was deciding in advance that your input wasn't going to change anything, so there was no point getting it early. I asked her about the money, about the message suggesting I get a smaller share or be bought out early. This was the part I'd been most nervous to bring up, because unlike the assisted living planning, which I genuinely believe came from a place of Lisa being overwhelmed and trying to manage a crisis. The inheritance conversation felt different to me. It felt like it had nothing to do with Mom's immediate care, and everything to do with an assumption about who deserved what, made by 3 people about a 4th person who wasn't there to respond. Lisa got quiet again. "That one I don't have as good an excuse for," she said. Honestly, I think it came from a place of, Mark's been struggling a little since the divorce, and Derek and Renee just found out they're having a 2nd kid, and Renee's going to be on reduced hours for a while, and I just started doing this math in my head about who needed it more, and you and Aaron both have stable jobs, and it felt like an easy place for the math to land. But Renee, that's not my decision to make. That's not anyone's decision to make alone about anyone else's share. I think I knew that, even while I was typing it, and I think that's part of why I wanted it in a separate chat, because some part of me knew that if you saw it, you'd push back, and I didn't want to deal with the pushback. Which, now that I'm saying it out loud, sounds exactly as bad as it is. Before the bigger conversations happened, I talked to Mark and Derek separately, each in their own short phone calls, and I think those calls are worth describing too, because they were different from my conversation with Lisa in ways that surprised me. Mark's reaction was the most immediately apologetic, but also, in some ways, the least reflective. He kept saying, "I should have said something. I knew it felt off, but I just went along with it." In a way that felt true, but also like he hadn't really sat with why he'd gone along with it. When I pushed a little, asked him what he'd actually thought, reading Lisa's message about the inheritance split, he admitted that he'd felt a flicker of discomfort at the time, but it was easier to just leave it on read than to be the one who brought it up. I told him I appreciated the honesty, and I meant it, but I also told him that it was easier not to say anything was exactly the dynamic that had let this go on for 3 months, and that I hoped, going forward, the 4 of us could get a little more comfortable with the discomfort of saying something in the moment, rather than after the fact. Derek's call was harder in a different way, because Derek was the one who'd actually created the chat, even if by accident that I was in it, and he was clearly carrying a lot of guilt about the original mix-up, in a way that I had to actively work to separate from the actual issue. "I feel like this is all my fault," he said, more than once, "because if I hadn't messed up the contacts, none of this would have happened." I told him, as gently as I could, that I didn't think the contact mix-up was the problem. The problem was that there was a mom stuff too to accidentally add someone to in the first place, and that it had existed for 3 months before his mistake brought it to light. "If you'd added the right Renee back in December," I said, "this conversation just wouldn't be happening right now, but the chat would still exist, and I'd still not be in it. And I think that's the actual thing we need to talk about, not the mix-up itself." I don't think Derek had fully separated those 2 things in his head until that call, and I could hear him sort of recalibrating in real time. Over the next week, the 4 of us, plus the other Renee, Derek's wife, who I want to say handled the whole thing with a lot of grace, given that she'd been an unwitting participant in a conversation that named her as a reason for cutting me out of money, had 2 more conversations. One over a group video call and one in person at Mom's house, while Mom was at a doctor's appointment with a home health aide. The group video call happened first, a few days after my conversation with Lisa, and I want to describe it honestly. It was awkward, in the specific way that conversations are awkward when everyone has clearly rehearsed what they're going to say and is also clearly aware that everyone else has done the same thing. Mark went first, and his apology was shorter and more direct than I expected. He said, almost word for word, "I went along with something I had a bad feeling about, because speaking up felt harder than staying quiet, and that's on me, and I'm sorry." Derek went next, and his apology was longer and more emotional, circling back more than once to the contact mix-up before I gently steered him, the way I had on our earlier call, back toward the actual issue, the existence of the chat itself, not the accident that revealed it. The other Renee spoke too, which I hadn't expected, and said something that actually meant a lot to me. I want you to know I never saw that message about your share as something that had anything to do with me needing money more than you. I think Lisa was trying to find a reason that would feel less personal, and our situation just happened to be convenient for that. I don't want you to ever feel like our baby is the reason any of this happened. The in-person conversation, a few days after that, was the one that actually got into the details of what would change going forward. And this is where Mom came into it, because by that point, we decided as a group that the honest thing to do was to tell her, at least in general terms, that there'd been some planning happening that she hadn't been part of either, and that we wanted to start over with her included from the beginning. I wasn't sure how Mom would react to that, whether she'd be hurt or feel like she was being treated as fragile, or worse, feel like the whole conversation confirmed some fear she might have about becoming a burden. But Mom's reaction surprised all of us. She listened to Lisa explain it. Lisa took the lead on that part, which felt right, given everything. And when Lisa finished, Mom was quiet for a moment and then said, "Well, I'm glad you were all thinking about it, even if you went about it a little sideways. But I've got opinions about my own life, you know. I've had 71 years of practice having them." We didn't undo everything that had happened in Mom stuff too. Some of it didn't need undoing. The assisted living research Lisa had done was genuinely useful, and once it was brought into the open, I actually found it really helpful. I just wanted to have been part of forming it, not just receiving it as a finished product. We ended up deciding together that instead of a trial weekend framed as a getaway, we'd have an honest conversation with Mom about what we'd been looking into, and let her be part of deciding what happened next, which, it turned out, she very much wanted to be, and had some strong opinions about, including ruling out the Citrus Heights facility entirely because, as she put it, "I went to a baby shower there once for someone's daughter, and the carpet smelled like a swimming pool." Mom also had a reaction to the assisted living question itself that none of us had really planned for, which is that she didn't want to move at all, at least not yet, and had specific, reasonable-sounding ideas about what would actually help her stay in the house safely, grab bars in the bathroom, a stair lift for the half flight down to the garage, maybe a part-time aide a few days a week. The kind of thing that, Lisa admitted afterward, had been on a list in Mom stuff too, labeled stopgap options. Probably not enough long-term, but had gotten less attention than the assisted living research, because the assisted living research had felt like the real plan, and the stopgap options had felt like delaying the inevitable. Hearing Mom describe in detail exactly the kind of modest, practical changes she wanted, and watching Lisa realize, in real time, that the option she'd mentally filed as not a real plan was actually Mom's first choice, was one of the more quietly important moments of that whole conversation, and it had nothing to do with me at all. It was just what happens when the person the plan is actually about gets to be in the room while it's being made. The money conversation was harder, and I want to be honest that it isn't fully resolved even now. We agreed, as a group, that any future conversation about dividing the eventual proceeds from the house, if and when that ever happens, which could be years from now, would include all four of us from the start, with no preformed proposals brought to the table as almost decided. That part I feel good about. What I don't feel fully resolved about is something smaller, but it stayed with me. Nobody has ever quite explained to me why Renee and Aaron are doing fine financially, was treated as a reason my share specifically should shrink, rather than, say, a reason the family might collectively help Mark or Derek and Renee in some other way that didn't involve permanently reducing what I'd eventually inherit. At one point in the in-person conversation, I tried to articulate this directly. I said something like, I want to understand the actual principle here, because I don't think it's really about the money. $50,000 or $60,000, eventually, split 4 ways, isn't going to change my life either way. But I keep getting stuck on the idea that Renee is doing fine became a reason to give Renee less, instead of a reason for the 4 of us to talk about whether anyone needs help right now, in a way that doesn't involve quietly redrawing what was always going to be an equal split. Because once you start saying, this person doesn't need their share as much, that logic doesn't really have a natural stopping point. It just depends on who's doing the math, and about who and when. Lisa didn't really have an answer to that, not in a defensive way, more like she was turning it over for the first time. Mark, actually, was the one who eventually said something that I think was the most honest response anyone gave that whole week. I think the truth is, in the moment, it just felt like free money on the table, and Renee doesn't need it as much, was the easiest story to tell about why it could go somewhere else. I don't think anyone actually thought it through as a principle. I think we just liked the math better when it worked out that way. I appreciated that he said it, even though, or maybe especially because, it wasn't a comfortable thing to admit. We talked around this a little more in the in-person conversation, but I think it's one of those things that's going to take longer than a week to actually work through, and honestly, I'm okay with that. Some things don't get a clean resolution in one conversation, and I'd rather sit with an honest, we're still figuring this out, than a quick, we're sorry. It's fixed now that papers over something real. Here's something else that's happened since then, which I didn't expect. The main family group chat has gotten busier again, not with logistics exactly, but with the kind of low-stakes, slightly silly stuff that used to define it before Mom's fall. Mark sent a photo last week of a raccoon that's apparently been raiding his trash cans, with the caption, "We are at war." Mom sent a photo of her garden, which is recovering nicely now that she's back to mostly normal mobility, with about 15 tomatoes she's clearly very proud of. Mom stuff, too, still exists. Technically, none of us have deleted it, which feels almost symbolic, like none of us wants to pretend the 3 months it existed didn't happen, but it's been quiet since that week. Any actual planning now happens either in family, with everyone present, or in person with everyone present. The other Renee jokes, now, that she's going to start going by her middle name in group chats, just to avoid future confusion, which, given how all of this started, might honestly be the most practical outcome of the whole thing. When I sit back and think about all of this now, here's what stands out to me most. The first thing is about how a for now decision can quietly become permanent. Lisa didn't sit down one day and decide forever that I'd be excluded from decisions about Mom. She made a decision about one chat for what felt like practical reasons in the middle of a stressful week, and then 3 months passed, and that one decision had become the default shape of how planning happened, simply because nobody revisited it. I think about that a lot now in my own life, too. How many, just for now, arrangements I've made, in my marriage, at work, with my own kids, that have quietly become permanent just because revisiting them never felt urgent. The second thing is about the difference between being protected from stress and being protected from information. Lisa genuinely believed she was protecting me from a half-formed plan, from unnecessary worry, from a conversation before there was anything to actually decide. But what she was actually doing was deciding, on my behalf, what I was capable of handling. And that's a very different thing than protecting someone, even when it comes from a caring place. The third thing is about labels and how easily they calcify. Renee gets emotional about this stuff is, on its own, just an observation, and not even an unfair one. I do get emotional, especially about things involving my dad and now my mom. But that observation, once it existed in writing, in a chat I wasn't in, stopped being a description of how I might react and became a justification for what I didn't need to be told. I think about how many other labels exist about all of us in other people's heads that we never get to see or respond to, quietly shaping decisions we don't even know are being made. I've started, since this happened, occasionally asking the people close to me, Aaron, my closest friend from college, even my own kids in age-appropriate ways, some version of, is there something about how you see me that affects how you act around me that I might not know about? It's a strange question to ask, and most of the time the answer is small or even funny, but twice now it's led to a conversation that mattered, and I think that's directly because of what I read in Mom Stuff too. The fourth thing is about money, and how often it gets discussed through a lens of who needs it more rather than what was actually promised or fair or agreed to. I understand why Lisa's brain went there. It's a very human instinct, especially when you're trying to solve a real problem, like Derek and Renee's reduced income with a new baby coming. But who needs it more is a conversation everyone affected gets to be part of. Or it isn't really a fair conversation at all, it's just one person's judgment, applied to everyone else. And the fifth thing, the one I think about most, is about the accident itself. None of this was planned. Derek didn't mean to add me to that chat. If anything, the version of events where I was never accidentally added is the version where none of this ever comes to light, where Mom Stuff too just continues quietly, maybe for years, maybe forever, and I never know any of it happened. I don't think that would have been a better outcome. I think it would have just been a slower one. The same gap, the same drift, just never surfacing, never getting the chance to be talked about, and at least partially repaired. A few weeks ago, Lisa and I were at Mom's house together, helping her rearrange some furniture to make room for the new grab bars, and during a break, Lisa said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. "You know what's funny," she said, "is that if you'd never seen that chat, I probably would have felt fine about all of it. Not great, but fine. I would have told myself it worked out, that everyone got what they needed, that it was practical. It's only because you saw it that I had to actually look at it, and I don't love what I saw." I told her I thought that was true for a lot of things, that being seen, even by accident, is sometimes the only thing that makes us actually look at ourselves. I got lucky, in a strange way, that a small technical mistake forced a conversation that probably needed to happen regardless. I don't know how many families have a version of Mom Stuff too, running quietly in the background right now, with no accidental notification ever coming to bring it into the light. I hope, if yours does, you find your way to that conversation some other way, before an accident has to do it for you. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. Has your family ever had a side conversation that you found out about by accident, and how did it go once it was out in the open? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. Thanks so much for watching and for sitting with Renee's story today. I'll see you in the next one.